You are standing in a dim workshop, the air thick with the mingled scent of smoke, wax, and rendered animal fat. A small window lets in a stripe of pale morning light, cutting across wooden tables cluttered with molds, scissors, and half-finished candles that lean slightly to one side. This is the world of a candle maker in late medieval England, around the year 1370. A world that flickers, quite literally, between light and darkness. Candles were not just sources of illumination. They were symbols of status, time, and devotion. To understand the life of a medieval candle maker is to peer into one of the most practical and monotonous corners of human history, a profession driven by patience, precision, and a surprising degree of superstition. Our candle maker's name was Edwin of Ely. He lived in a small town not far from the fens, the flat, damp lands that stretched across eastern England. His cottage stood close to the church because, like most chandlers, his livelihood depended partly on the needs of the parish. Monks required candles for prayers. The church required them for processions, and the wealthy required them to light their long, slow dinners. But for Edwin, candle making was not a craft of luxury. It was a daily repetition of small, tedious acts. Every morning began before dawn, when the world was still cold and gray. He would stoke the fire in his workshop, a hearth blackened with years of soot, and melt the tallow in a large iron pot. The smell was heavy and unpleasant. Tallow came from animal fat, mostly sheep or cattle, and unless it was carefully purified, it gave off a rancid odor even when burned. Beeswax candles were far superior, cleaner, sweeter, brighter, but only the church and nobility could afford them. Edwin's fingers were often slick with grease, his nails perpetually rimmed with residue. The repetitive labor gave his hands a kind of toughness, yet the warmth of the wax left his skin soft in strange places. He would twist the wicks from linen thread, hang them across a wooden frame, and dip them again and again into the melted tallow, allowing each layer to cool slightly before dipping again, dozens of times until the candle took shape. The process was as slow as the passage of a winter day. The rhythm of candle making mirrored the rhythm of medieval life, measured, methodical, and deeply bound to necessity. Most villagers made their own crude candles when they could, but in towns, the trade belonged to the chandlers. They were respected in a quiet, practical way. They provided the comfort of light, but they also dealt with its fragility, the knowledge that one gust of wind could undo an hour's labor. Edwin often thought about that fragility. He hated the dark, though he would never admit it aloud. Perhaps that's why he chose this trade, to push against the darkness, even if only for a few flickering hours each night. His wife, Agnes, often teased him for it. "You make a living from the very thing you fear," she said. "Maybe that's how God keeps balance in the world." When evening fell, Edwin's shop took on a strange beauty. Rows of candles hung drying from their wicks, glimmering softly in the fading light. The floor was scattered with wax strips, like frozen teardrops. Sometimes, a child from the village would peek through the open door to watch the dance of the firelight on the cooling molds. For them, the workshop seemed magical, a place where light was born from nothing. But to Edwin, it was all work, slow, repetitive, and rarely profitable. The church dictated prices, and guilds controlled supply. He could not sell beeswax candles without a license, and his tallow candles fetched only a modest coin. He kept careful records of his sales on scraps of parchment, entries written in a shaky hand. 2 dozen to Father Robert for the feast of St. Martin, for candles to the baker's wife. Thick cut, poor wick. Each sale was a small light in his ledger, marking another day survived. Life for a candle maker was also shaped by seasons. In winter, demand grew as days shortened. In summer, it waned. And yet, Edwin found something soothing in the pattern. He liked how predictable it was, how his hands knew what to do without thinking. He could lose himself in the repetition, dip, lift, cool, trim, and for a few quiet moments, the world seemed perfectly ordinary. Still, there were nights when the fear returned. Sometimes a storm would roll across the fens, filling the sky with thunder. The power of nature felt immense, and Edwin would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between flashes. He would listen to the wind rattle the shutters and think about how much he depended on flame. That thin, trembling boundary between safety and shadow. There was one evening, in the dead of winter, when the church bell rang after sunset. A messenger came running through the snow. A candle had fallen during Mass, setting fire to a section of the wooden choir stalls. The flames were put out quickly, but it caused quite a stir. Some said it was a sign from God. Others blamed careless hands. Father Robert sent for Edwin the next morning. "We'll need new candles for the altar," he said, "and perhaps some caution in how they're placed." Edwin nodded solemnly, though inside he felt a strange unease. The accident reminded him how his craft, so mundane, so ordinary, could also be dangerous. Light could destroy as easily as it comforted. That paradox lingered in his mind for weeks afterward. He began experimenting with thicker bases and shorter wicks, testing ways to make his candles burn slower and safer. The experiments were dull but steadying. They gave him purpose. And yet, every time he lit a new batch, he found himself watching the tiny flame, as if it might reveal something more, a truth about the delicate balance between creation and ruin. In those quiet moments, surrounded by rows of flickering lights, he would sometimes whisper a small prayer, not for wealth or success, but simply for the light to last a little longer. It is easy, from the distance of centuries, to see Edwin's world as quaint or primitive. But if you listen closely, beneath the hiss of boiling tallow and the soft drip of cooling wax, you can hear the pulse of an entire civilization learning to manage darkness, not to conquer it, but to coexist with it. The candle maker's work was humble and perhaps dull to modernize. Yet in every thread of wick and every pool of melted fat lay a reflection of human persistence, the quiet labor that kept the world alight, one fragile flame at a time. And as Edwin watched another candle gutter low, he wondered, not for the first time, what would happen if one day no one made candles anymore? Would the world simply learn to sleep in the dark again? Morning in Eli began with the faint tolling of the church bell, a slow, measured rhythm that seemed to echo the pace of time itself. Edwin of Eli rose before the second bell, as he always did, his joints stiff from the cold and the years of bending over wax and flame. His small home was quiet except for the low crackle of embers in the hearth, and the soft breath of his wife still asleep. He moved through the dim light carefully, not because he feared waking her, but because he feared the dark. The irony was never lost on him. A man who spent his life creating light, but could never quite banish his unease when it was gone. Perhaps, he often thought, it wasn't the dark itself that frightened him, but what it represented, the unknown. The pause between days, the silence that swallowed everything. As he entered his workshop, the smell of yesterday's tallow greeted him, sour, heavy, faintly metallic. He opened the shutters to let in the gray morning, and dust motes drifted like suspended ash through the air. The tools on his bench were lined up in their familiar order: shears, molds, ladles, spools of wick. Each one had a history, each one a layer of wax built up from years of use. To an outsider, they would look unremarkable, but to Edwin, they were the instruments of survival. Not just his own, but of a trade that kept towns running when daylight failed. The Guild of Chandlers, the Candle Makers Guild in Eli, was small but strict. Every member swore oaths to maintain the purity of wax and the fairness of measure. No tallow could be adulterated with foreign fat, no wick could be made from coarse thread. Apprenticeships lasted 7 years, during which a boy would learn not only the craft itself, but the rituals that surrounded it. Candles, after all, were not mere goods. They were sacred objects in their own quiet way. The guild kept its books in a wooden chest at the town hall. It was said that inside those pages lay the secrets of mixture and temperature, the precise ratios that determined a candle's longevity. In truth, most of it was repetition, copied formulas, old measurements, but the guild treated it as scripture. Even so, rumors circulated of chandlers who broke the code, who used cheaper fats, or diluted beeswax with oils. Those who were caught were fined heavily, sometimes even banned from trading. Edwin had never broken a rule. He had no reason to. His business was modest, his customers loyal, but he found himself increasingly weary of the constraints. The guild meetings, held monthly, were long and dull affairs filled with complaints about taxation, disputes over candle weights, and endless discussions about wax imports from Flanders. Still, these gatherings served a deeper purpose. They preserved the illusion of order in a world that often teetered toward chaos. The church and the light was not merely a commodity. It was theology. The church taught that illumination represented divine truth, and darkness, the absence of it. Every flicker in the cathedral was a symbol of faith pushing back against sin. To supply that light was, in a way, a holy duty. This belief gave chandlers a peculiar status. Though they were craftsmen of the lower guilds, their work touched the sacred. Father Robert, the parish priest, often reminded Edwin of this. Your candles, he said one evening while inspecting a new batch, carry prayers with their smoke. Each one burns for the soul of a man. Edwin nodded politely, but said nothing. He found such talk comforting, but also oddly burdensome. To think that his clumsy hands, soaked in grease and soot, could influence the fate of souls was a responsibility he neither wanted nor believed in. Fully, still, he took extra care when preparing the church's candles. He used purer fat, cleaner molds, and wicks spun tightly to ensure even burning. He wrapped each candle in linen before delivery, as if the gesture could ward off imperfection. And yet, The thought always lingered that no matter how carefully he crafted them, all candles were destined to vanish. Their purpose was to disappear, slowly, into smoke and air. Wax wars be the late 1370s. The price of tallow had begun to rise. The guild blamed the wars in France, which disrupted trade routes and limited access to cattle fat. Others pointed to the growing influence of foreign merchants who undercut local markets. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. The poor could no longer afford candles, and the chandlers could no longer sell enough to live comfortably. Edwin felt the strain acutely. He began saving every scrap of leftover wax, melting down old candle stubs to reuse in smaller forms. He even took on repair work, reshaping broken candles for a fraction of the cost. His workshop became a small archive of reused light, each lump of wax carrying the memory of another flame. It was around this time that a new kind of competition appeared: imported beeswax from Flanders. The merchants brought it by river, claiming it burned longer and cleaner. The church, naturally, favored it, and the guilds of London soon adopted it as the new standard for ecclesiastical use. For Edwin, this was both an opportunity and a threat. He could not afford such wax, but he admired its perfection. Smooth golden, faintly scented with honey. It was everything tallow was not. He tried once, using a small piece given to him by a traveling merchant, to make a single candle of beeswax. The process was easier, the scent lighter. When he lit it, the flame burned steady and bright. Unlike the smoky sputter of tallow, he watched it for hours entranced. It seemed alive, calm, enduring, self-contained. When it finally burned out, he felt a strange sadness, as though something wiser than himself had departed the room. After that, he began keeping notes. He tested the temperature of melting points, the ratio of wick to wax, the size of molds. He made charts in his ledger, crude but meticulous. It wasn't invention in the grand sense, merely observation. Yet in his small workshop, Edwin was unknowingly part of a quiet revolution in craftsmanship, the slow birth of standardization. A town in shadowed winter of 1381 was especially long. Supplies were scarce, tempers short. The townspeople relied on rushlights, thin reeds dipped in fat instead of proper candles. They burned unevenly and gave off foul smoke. Edwin's sales fell sharply. The guild sent letters urging cooperation, but many chandlers ignored the decrees, selling their wares in secret at inflated prices. It was, in its own dull way, a crisis. To make matters worse, news of unrest spread from the south, murmurs of rebellion among peasants against taxes and landlords. Ely was small, but the fear reached even here. People gathered in the tavern to whisper about uprisings. Father Robert warned his flock to stay loyal. The world, it seemed, was darkening in more ways than one. Edwin stayed in his workshop, trying to ignore it all. He made candles as he always had, dipping and cooling while outside. Rumors of revolt flickered like distant torches. Perhaps he sensed dimly that the world was changing, that the steady rhythm of his life belonged to a fading order. But he said nothing. He simply worked as men like him always did, carrying light into the gloom without asking whether anyone would notice. The visit it was during one of those gray afternoons, when the door creaked open and a stranger entered. A man in fine clothes, not a noble, but clearly of means. He introduced himself as Thomas of Norwich, a merchant traveling north. He had heard, he said, that Edwin's candles burn cleaner than most. Ideal in light, Thomas explained, and I'm looking for reliable men. Edwin listened cautiously. The merchant spoke of new markets, cities where guild rules were looser, where a chandler could sell freely. The world is changing, Thomas said. Soon enough, you'll have to choose whether to cling to the old ways or make your own. That night, Edwin sat by the hearth, watching a single candle burn. The flame wavered slightly, throwing shadows across the wall. He thought about what the merchant had said. The idea of leaving Ely seemed impossible. The town, the church, the guild. They were all he had ever known. And yet, he felt a small stirring of curiosity. Could there be a life where light was not controlled by oaths and dues? Agnes noticed his distraction. You're thinking again, she said softly. What about this time? Edwin smiled faintly. About darkness, he replied, and how far it really reaches. He didn't sleep well that night. The wind moaned through the chimney, and the last candle flickered until it died, leaving the room in silence. As the last glow faded, Edwin began to wonder if he ever left the guild. If he broke the order of things and made candles on his own terms, would the darkness follow him anyway? The spring of 1380 arrived with an uneasy quiet. The frost melted from the fens, and with it came the smell of wet earth and slow decay. In Ely, the days stretched longer, though the townsfolk still lit candles at dusk. Habits were slow to change, and the fear of the dark remained constant. For Edwin of Ely, the candle maker who had spent most of his life coaxing light from tallow and wick, this spring felt different. Perhaps it was the merchant's visit that unsettled him, or perhaps it was the sense that something old was ending. The guild had begun losing influence. Younger craftsmen no longer paid their dues faithfully, and the church, always the most faithful customer, had started buying imported beeswax in bulk from foreign traders. The light that once depended on his labor now arrived in neat barrels, stamped with foreign seals. He was still a guild member in name, but fewer meetings were held. The old master chandler, a man named Geoffrey, had fallen ill, and no one stepped forward to lead. Some said it was because people had other worries now, plague, taxes, or the faint tremors of rebellion still rippling through the countryside. Light, after all, was no longer sacred. It was simply convenient. Edwin still made candles every morning. The rhythm soothed him, melting, dipping, cooling, but the orders were fewer. Father Robert visited one afternoon to apologize. "We'll be using beeswax for the high altar now," the priest said gently. "The bishop insists, but I'll still need your tallow candles for the parish hall, if you don't mind." Edwin nodded. He minded, of course, but he said nothing. It wasn't Father Robert's fault. The church, like the rest of England, was changing. The new wealth of merchants, the rise of towns, the slow shift from land to trade, all of it was reshaping what people valued. He often wondered, as he dipped another wick, whether his craft would survive at all. The merchants returned a month later. The merchant Thomas of Norwich returned. His cloak was travel-worn, his boots caked with mud from distant towns. He spoke briskly, his tone a mixture of familiarity and ambition. "I'm heading to Cambridge," he said. "The scholars there have begun ordering fine wax candles for their libraries. They work late, it seems, studying, reading. A new kind of devotion, if you ask me." Edwin raised an eyebrow. "Books by candlelight?" Thomas smiled. "Knowledge needs its own light now, and I thought, perhaps you might make a few samples for me. I could take them along, sell them on your behalf. Tallow or wax, whichever you like." The offer hung in the air like the scent of warm fat. It wasn't much, but it was something. "I don't have beeswax," Edwin said. "Then make what you have." The merchant replied, "Good tallow, clean wick. The scholars won't mind the smell if it helps them see." That night, Edwin stayed awake long after Agnes had gone to bed. He sat at his workbench, listening to the faint hiss of the fire. On the table before him lay his tools, plain, familiar, loyal. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of purpose. He spent 3 days preparing the batch. He filtered the tallow carefully, straining it through linen to remove impurities. He trimmed the wicks thinner than usual, hoping for a steadier flame. When he finished, 20 candles stood on the drying rack. Smooth, pale, nearly uniform. They looked, he thought, almost elegant. Thomas took them a week later, wrapped neatly in cloth. He promised to return with word of their fate. Days of waiting stretched into months. Edwin went about his routines as usual, selling a few candles to villagers, supplying the parish when needed. The town of Ely continued its slow rhythm. Children played in the mud near the churchyard. The market square filled and emptied with each passing week, but something had shifted within him. The monotony that once soothed him now carried a weight of uncertainty. Each evening, when the sun dipped below the flat horizon of the fens, he lit a single candle and watched the flame as though it might speak. He thought often about the scholars in Cambridge, sitting at wooden desks surrounded by parchment and ink, their faces lit by the same fragile light he'd shaped with his hands. It comforted him to imagine that his work still had purpose, that somewhere, in the quiet hours of study, his light helped a man see a word more clearly, a thought more deeply. Agnes and the quiet Yersanes noticed his distraction. She had long since learned the rhythm of his moods, the slow rise and fall of contentment that followed the fortunes of his trade. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she said gently, "You still hate the dark, don't you?" Edwin smiled faintly. "I suppose I do, but I've made peace with it. It's part of the work, after all." She nodded. "Maybe the darkness isn't what we think it is. Maybe it's just the space where light rests." He liked that thought. It stayed with him for years afterward, through quiet winters and modest summers. As Ely changed around him, the world beyond the town was moving quickly now. Trade routes expanded, cities grew, and the first whispers of new inventions began to travel along merchant roads. Oil lamps, some said, burned brighter and cleaner than candles. Others spoke of clever glass lanterns brought from Italy. To most in Ely, these were rumors, stories from another world. But Edwin listened carefully. He had lived long enough to know that every new light eventually replaced an old one. The last order, it was a gray autumn morning when Thomas returned for the last time. His beard had silvered, and the lines around his eyes were deeper. "I came to settle an old debt," he said, placing a small pouch of coins on the table. "Your candles sold well in Cambridge. The scholars liked them, so they burned longer than most." Edwin blinked in quiet surprise. "Truly." Thomas nodded. "But they've moved on now. Oil lamps, mostly. New things coming from the continent. Cleaner, safer. I suppose your trade will grow harder." The words stung, though not unexpectedly. Edwin smiled politely, thanking the merchant for his honesty. When Thomas left, the workshop felt emptier than usual. That evening, he told Agnes that he was thinking of stopping. "No one needs what I make anymore," he said softly. She looked at him for a long moment before replying. "Maybe that's not the point. You've spent your life making light for others. That's enough." He said nothing more. That night, he made one last batch of candles, not for sale, but for himself. He used the cleanest tallow he could find and shaped them with care. 20 candles, just like the ones he had sent to Cambridge. When they were finished, he lined them on the shelf above the hearth, their smooth surfaces catching the faint glow of the fire. The candle that wouldn't burn weeks passed. The candles sat unused, gathering a fine layer of dust. One night, a storm rolled over Ely. The wind howled through the cracks in the door, and the power of the weather, that old medieval fear, returned. The hearth fire sputtered and died in the darkness. Edwin reached for one of the candles. He lit it slowly, shielding the flame with his hand. The room filled with soft light, gentle and wavering. But as he watched it burn, something strange happened. The wick sputtered once, then steadied, and then the flame refused to grow. It burned low, stubbornly small, a faint glow clinging to the tip of the wick. Agnes, half asleep, murmured, "It's a poor one, that candle." Edwin only smiled. "No," he said softly, "it's enough." He sat beside it for hours, watching the flame's tiny persistence against the storm outside. When it finally went out, leaving only a thin curl of smoke, he felt at peace. He never made another candle after that. The afterglow. Edwin of Ely died in the spring of 1390. In his sleep, after nearly 50 years at his trade, the guild recorded his passing in its register with a brief note: "Master Edwin, maker of light, gone to rest." His workshop was taken over briefly by a younger man, but it never flourished again. Within a generation, oil lamps and imported wax had replaced most local tallow production. The Chandlers' Guild of Ely faded into memory, its books stored in a damp chest in the town hall, its rules forgotten. But light, in its many forms, continued. The same patience, the same human need to keep darkness at bay, passed from wax to oil, from oil to gas, and eventually, centuries later, to the invisible threads of electricity that now hum through our world. And perhaps, somewhere in that long chain of inventions, a trace of Edwin's work remains. A small flicker of devotion to the simple act of making light where there was none. The reflection. When you think of the medieval world, you might imagine kings and wars, knights and cathedrals. But beneath all that grandeur was a quieter history. The history of those who made the world livable. Men like Edwin, whose craft asked for no glory, whose tools were ordinary, whose work dissolved nightly into darkness. The candlemaker's life was not extraordinary. It was steady, dull, repetitive. But in that repetition lay a form of endurance. He may have hated the dark, but he learned to live with it, and perhaps that is the truest kind of mastery. The light he made never lasted, but neither did the night. And so, in the endless rhythm of wax and flame, there is something timeless, the quiet persistence of those who, without realizing it, carried humanity forward, one flickering light at a time. Humanity forward, one flickering light at a time.